LittleBigPlanet, on this little big planet of ours, has been a deeply influential PlayStation video game that at one point used to be synonymous with the PlayStation, featured in many of their ads or related content. The early 2010s and just before were the years of creativity, you could say, being the years that the LittleBigPlanet series, now featuring half a dozen or so games or more in it as a franchise, would call home and make their mark first. But although LittleBigPlanet still exists in many gamers' hearts and minds today, it exists mostly as a memory of what used to be a large shift from a time where LBP was considered a mascot for the PlayStation platform, or at least Sackboy was. That's why we are covering not just LittleBigPlanet 1, but 2, 3, and the remaining spin-offs and ports too, to get a better picture of what happened to the entire LBP series. A series that once sat amongst titans. That's exactly what we do with New Cases on the Death of a Game series, a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to the death or process of dying of a game or company by utilizing a timeline of events filled with clues and bits of evidence. But most importantly, we activate our detective intuition, especially during the final deduction, where we crack the case for good, in case you missed any of the clues along the way. Well, detectives, what are we waiting for? What are we waiting for? Oh wait, I already made the joke. Grab your PlayStation controller and your mind full of creativity. Let's get to work on this case that features an inanimate object turned main character and the catalyst of all the creativity therein. It's a LittleBigPlanet kind of mystery, so let's get to the case. The story begins quite far back, showing that creativity, like in other episodes of DOAG, is not something that just comes easy or quickly. No, the origins for LittleBigPlanet are no different than many of the other iconic, creative-focused games. And that's because for such a game to exist, it has to be created first. Okay, well, duh. But I mean literally the concept of the game itself first. The team behind what would become a revolution in creative gaming would first find their success and experiences with another British video game studio known for quite iconic and innovative titles as well, Lionhead Studios. The beginnings were surely humble, with the team beginning work on a small platformer dubbed Ragdoll Kung Fu, which really in many ways felt more like a tech demo they pushed to release, to show off what they were capable of as a team, more so than as a game or product. This team would feature all the original developers that would go on to make LBP, including the founders and developers Mark Healy, Kareem Tooney, Alex Evans, and Dave Smith. After a team trip to see Howl's Moving Castle, they would feel the creative juices flowing and start to theorize on what they wanted their next game to be, something they wanted to be playable on console, since Ragdoll Kung Fu was actually a PC title. And for further lore for those interested, was the first non-Valve game on Steam. Whoa, dude. Just a few months after their team would cook up Ragdoll Kung Fu, and the Lionhead Studio bros would depart the company and form their own studio in Guildford, England, January 4th, 2006. That company titled Media Molecule, and their motto being, doing the most with the least, trying to keep their team as lean as humanly possible. Mark Healy would take the creative direction as the creative director set to lead the next project, largely in part due to his success with Ragdoll Kung Fu. Alex Evans would join the team as the technical director, forming the foundational tech background for the company, alongside David Smith, who was in charge of programming the gameplay. Kareem Tooney was also the art director behind what would become quite an iconic look for the next game. These creatives and developers weren't just talking heads, they were contributors in game development, though it would show a bit of a weakness in their company structure or focus in some ways, with no business person really situated on the team early on as a founder that we know of. Something we saw also with Troika Games, one of the more iconic RPG studios that we covered on the Death of a Game series. Shortly after their formulation, Media Molecule as a team would start pitching a prototype project they were working on, something they were calling Craft World, which was more of a 2D platformer side-scroller game that would then become famous in their next game. And frankly, as they would also admit, was a bit of a vague pitch, intentionally kept vague as to not overwhelm those they would pitch to with the creative aspects they were trying to push, which would allow for players on console to create their own levels and more. Their big pitch being to the president of SEWS, or Sony Computer Entertainment Worldwide Studio, which was the former name of what is now known as PlayStation Studios. Man, I'm so thankful they changed that name. The central group that managed first-party video game development for Sony, and their CEO, Phil Harrison. Phil would catch on to the lack of focus on the real gold being showcased, the creative aspects of the game, and after a lengthy 3-hour demo session with the team would agree to a 6-month funding deal, they focused more on the creative aspects that seemed to make the game more unique. This would form the basis of what Media Molecule would use to fund their next demo. one that would manage to buy them enough time to work on their first major project as a company, a project that would ultimately not be theirs, as the licensing deal that they would later go into with Sony would relinquish any ownership of any of the new IPs they would create alongside Sony. In a bizarre turn of events, their first game, now dubbed LittleBigPlanet, originally set to launch in the early 2008, but after SCE found out that LBP had used a track dubbed Tafa Niang, and I'm probably butchering that, sorry, I don't have good Arabic, which featured verses from the Quran, they would be forced to delay the game after, and update to remove the lyrics, though they would also use this time to improve the online functionality of their newly set to release game. LittleBigPlanet would drop October 27, 2008 on PS3 and would go on to be rated the best game in the series, unveiling and codifying many of the creative and fun aspects that LBP would become known for as a series. LittleBigPlanet, at its core, was a simple game. It was a platformer that also allowed for players to custom make and build their own levels. The game would consist of two main modes, LittleBigPlanet, which was the game's story mode, where each level could be replayed and each level was designed around a movement aspect of the game's main character, an animated sack named Sackboy, and the second game mode being the main mode, My Moon, or previously known as the Create mode, and which would give you access to your own personal space where you could build, design, or store your own custom levels, games, and creations. While initially the only way to build an LBP was through platformer methods, players found ways to design different genres within a platformer, giving players more access to different forms of gameplay, such as vehicle levels, survival scenarios, and even puzzle maps. I think this showcases how when you give a community or a player base proper support and tools, they can do the rest. Just look at Skyrim, a game that launched without mods, pretty bare bones compared to previous test games. But it didn't matter when the community created years worth of content on their own, capiche? The critical reception for LBP was just as positive as the audience reception, with it managing to reach universal acclaim, scoring a massively impressive 95 out of 100, one of the highest Metacritic scores we have ever recorded on the Death of the Game series, from 85 different critics. Nothing was like LBP. Simply put, it was charming, fun, and yet managed to create an environment and community of gamers who wanted to create more fun. Later updates to the game would introduce a DLC store and an overhaul to the game's poor search functions, and also allow for online access to the My Moon mode, which didn't really launch with it. LBP wasn't just a critical hit either, it was a commercial success, spawning an entire series of games and managing to sell as an entry title a whopping 4.5 million copies. That was COD World at War levels at the time and even comparable to freaking GTA 4. LBP was anything short of a massive success for Media Molecule, and PlayStation as the extension, allowing to beef up to 34 employees. LBP was like Mario Maker before Mario Maker, and even fathered titles you can say in some ways, such as like King of Meat, Fall Guys, and more. To which they would then parlay into a PSP port of their PlayStation 3 title, which they would develop alongside SCE Studio Cambridge, who interestingly enough was behind the Medieval series, one that caught my interest heavily as a kid, and one that I rented from Hollywood Video. They would launch the PSP port November 17th, 2009, which would leverage the massively successful PSP handheld audience, managing to sell 2.6 million copies and score an 87 out of 100 on Metacritic, which was a respectable score for a port, especially when I can safely say that LBP PSP was more than just a port. It was a respectable enough to stand on its own title really, as it offered an impressive, unique, and new 23-level campaign. Though it had a lack of multiplayer that was kind of expected of a title at the time, since like the PSP was barely even going online as it was anyway. So I guess that not keeps the game from truly being considered like a great, amazing game. LBP as it was known, wasn't really designed as a title that was going to be updated post-launch, at least originally, but would ignore that and release update 1.21 dubbed Leerdammer, which would allow you to access Create mode with friends and have an upgraded location-based matchmaking to combat the lag and poor matchmaking in the game. According to SCE CEO Phil Harrison, man, I'm gonna get killed on these acronyms this video, LBP was originally designed to be an downloadable service that would monetize user-generated content, but that idea was scrapped early on, which might sound bad in current times, but was effectively them selling, a platform and selling like games over and over again, with some minor upgrades. Which is why November 2009 would prove to be a quite controversial month for the future of LBP and Media Molecule. It was the month that seemed to fight against the sequel expectations that were seemingly being placed on them by PlayStation, which was obvious due to their massive success. Danny Lever, a level designer, that's such an amazing name for a level designer, on LittleBigPlanet at the time would claim that a traditional sequel would be the most counterproductive thing you could do. which was referencing how community-focused the game was and how the point of the game, in a sense, was to build up this massive catalog of levels to keep people entertained endlessly. And a sequel could not only hurt backward compatibility with levels, it could further fragment this audience. But to be fair, the idea of selling the platform was kind of already discarded, and unless they were going to try and push that again, they were seemingly locked into making more sequels for a game they didn't originally want to make sequels for. It was a complex situation, but one that Media Molecule would have little decision-making in the process for, or with, because not only was their only game funded by and owned by Sony entirely, as they gave up the rights to the game when they accepted their licensing deal, Sony would just take things a tad further, into matrimony. Okay, just kidding, because the implications are kind of weirder that way, but they would acquire Media Molecule March 3rd, 2010, just 2 years after the game's launch. I see this as not only Sony wanting to acquire a deeply talented new studio who could just put out a hit, they wanted to also control the fate of the LBP series, and the fate of Media Molecule, which Sony was known for partnering with studios who would continue to make big hits for them, like Santa Monica Studio and the God of War series in PlayStation. A spin-off title would pop up out of nowhere, following the gap between the first and second LBP, dubbed Sackboy Prehistoric Moves, which was meant to be a PlayStation Move game that felt a lot more like a demo that most people forgot. So we'll move on. 3 years after the launch of the first game, which was pretty fast for a game that was trying to focus so much on community content, to be honest, but not fast for a typical sequel, which sometime could drop from year to year, LittleBigPlanet 2 would drop January 18th, 2011. LBP 2 would manage to also become universally acclaimed, just like the first game, scoring another A rating at 91 out of 100 from 86 different critics, managing to also impress the fans even more, becoming arguably the most liked game by the fan base in the series' history yet and beyond. Part of how it managed to do this was managing to be both expansive in terms of what it previously had offered with the first game, including more custom ways to build levels and play them out, with the new engine allowing for like racing, puzzle, and RPG type of games, and gameplay from the start. This was on top of the ability to create and customize AI bots, and interact with objects, including your own expanded physics-based movement. LBP 2 might have been the best game in the franchise history according to the fanbase, but it wasn't commercially, selling the worst in the franchise history from one of the mainline games at 3.43 million copies sold. I think this can be attributed to the fact that the game I didn't think had as much of a marketing push as the first game did, and the idea was a bit less novel this time around, which for some fans and critics felt like the game was a bit more of an expansion than a full game release. Still, LBP 2 will likely be many people in the comments' favorite or most memorable experiences of the series. This time, Media Molecule knew that post-launch updates were crucial to maintaining and improving their game that relied so heavily on its online ecosystem for the player base to succeed, which they would start expanding as early as February 2011 with the Cupcake update, and follow it with the 1.06 update later that same year, improving the game's stability, adding PlayStation Move, controller support, and some new creator logic such as angle, speed, and rotation sensors. But then, coming as a shock to the LBP player base, was the announcement that Media Molecule, the developer and father of the LBP series, would be stepping away from it, July 2011. According to later reports, this was because Media Molecule didn't want to be stuck into making more sequels in a facility like line production, and wanted the opportunity to make other creative projects, such as the project they would begin work on, titled Dreams. This must have been tough for them to negotiate, which is likely why they would still assist the next studio in charge of the series, LBP that is, in development on the trilogy title in an undisclosed amount. My personal commentary is I don't blame them. They had been cooking on the series now for 6 years, working at breakneck speeds, and Sony wasn't going to let them stop unless they made a big declaration like they just did that they were moving on to greener pastures. Emphasis on like the greener part. Not to mention, as much as it might hurt to move on from what you created, what they created, illegally, it was never theirs to begin with, sadly, so its future fate was pretty much out of their control, even though they created and led the massively successful IP, of course. An IP that successful, that like with many other successful IPs would be pimped out to other universes and crossovers to boost its popularity and crossover appeal. Their first PlayStation handheld was a smashing success, and Sony wanted a repeat with their now, without a leader, successful IP and LBP, which is why they would have Tarsier Studios, a Swedish developer who had good relationships with Bandai Namco as a support studio, and Double 11, another successful British support and port-focused video game studio. They would manage to release LittleBigPlanet on the PlayStation Vita, a console that we have actually covered on the Death of a Game series, as it was maligned despite having some incredibly impressive technical aspects. It would end up scoring pretty respectfully there too. Hell, a good score enough to yet again stand on their own, at an 88 out of 100 from 71 different critics. Also selling 1.3 million copies, which by the way made it the 4th best-selling title on the platform. of LittleBigPlanet might have slowed some, but LBP Vita was proof that if you reinvented yourself just enough, you could still impress and sell respectfully. That's because LBP Vita wasn't just sold on the strength of it being basically an LBP 2 port. It had, like the PSP version, a unique storyline, one that many fans of the series considered the best yet, and beyond, as it would tackle some darker concepts in the game for the first time, and feature multiple worlds players could traverse in an attempt to save the worlds from the evil puppeteer who was intent on stealing all joy and creativity from its inhabitants. Each world served as a unique gameplay and environment experience, and was essentially like playing an updated and expanded version of LittleBigPlanet 2. But it was an expansion and some, since this time they managed to leverage the Vita's online capabilities and allowed for players to share levels and connect online too. LBP Vita, despite the platform's woes, was massively successful for Sony and the LBP franchise, and hell, even the fanbase, since now they could enjoy 2 quality handheld games, while many games were making ports and doing the bare minimum to collect the maximum revenue, whereas at least LBP, whenever they would do them, they would put in far more effort and try to distinguish the games on their own, and not just rely on being like a good port. That was respectful. But misses were bound to happen, and most of the time they would come in the form of actual spin-off games utilizing and leveraging the powerful IP at the time, which they would continue on with a kart racer game dubbed LittleBigPlanet Karting, which released in November 6, 2011, and was developed in conjunction by 2 new support-style studios in United Front Games and San Diego Studio. The former being known for the well-liked but commercial dud Sleeping Dogs, and the latter for the MLB The Show series and Mod Nation, a relatively small-fish Mario Kart racer competitor far more known for how custom-friendly the game was more than anything else. They also had already worked together on Mod Nation Racers itself, and were hoping to do something similar again with the LittleBigPlanet IP. Problem being, that's pretty much all they did. LittleBigPlanet Karting was essentially Mod Nation Racers with a couple extra things, without the personality and charm of a classic LittleBigPlanet game, but featuring similar art and the same characters and world. Scoring averagely, at a 73 out of 100 from 69 different critics according to Metacritic, and similar amongst the fanbase, going on to be one of the most forgotten full releases in the series' history, and becoming an example of exactly what I just said. Not much more to comment on here with the karting affair. Let's remember it much like a real affair in the right context, which is not at all. The PS4 was set to launch in 2013, which was having many developers scrambling to unveil a new title for it, to capitalize on the massive success potentially set to come. One of the coolest ideas in LBP history was the attempt at a free-to-play hub-based game that was first announced in August 2013, but sadly was cancelled the next year. The idea behind LittleBigPlanet Hub was simple. It was a PS3 free-to-download and play game, and a game that would give access to the LBP 1 and 2 worlds, up to 16 levels in total, with an unrestricted free mode to it. The idea was a bit half-baked in a sense. Now you're trying to sell a game that was 2 games in one, but attacking that with a free-to-play model. Do I think there was a chance to still make money there? Of course, for sure. Especially since it would be the first free-to-play game in the game's history, but the main issue being that the next LBP was already deep in development, and so ultimately Sony would cancel the project with desires to focus on that development first, and have the desire not to split their audience for their new game. Which for me made no sense. Free-to-play players aren't really known for buying box games, which shows how out of touch Sony was at the time with online gaming, a trend they would carry on into the next decade too. Most interestingly enough, however, detectives, would be recent news that the LBP Hub would leak online, now becoming playable on emulators on the PC. The game plays exactly as it was described, a mix of the first 2 games on one platform, though it was a beta build and not fully finished to be honest, but still cool you can go and play it. A random mobile game would pop up wearing the LBP name titled Run Sackboy Run, which kind of sounds bad, but it was an endless runner game with nothing else to really speak about otherwise. The next LittleBigPlanet game would take a slew of developers working on it to push it past the finish line, even requiring some help in an undisclosed amount from Media Molecule. Led by Sumo Digital, known for their Sega Superstar Tennis and Sonic All-Star Racing Transformed game, though largely being known as a support studio themselves, which is probably why they had to enlist not just Media Molecule but like a dozen or so other developers to assist on development for LittleBigPlanet 3, which would launch November 18th, 2014 on the PS4, the new PlayStation platform. Now, if you weren't there for the launch, or haven't personally played LittleBigPlanet 3, you would think that the game deserves to be rated amongst some of the best LittleBigPlanet games, as it's by far the most complex of the games and has the deepest levels. But then you would be missing out on 2 crucial contextual points. First, launch was catastrophic for Sumo Digital and Sony with LittleBigPlanet 3, for the first time in the series' history, leading to many bugs and glitches that range from annoying but persistent to game-breaking. The amount of times people would have their profiles corrupted only to be able to fix it by deleting it altogether was nuts, leading to losing all of your progress on levels, or even any content shared online. This would be a heavy contributing factor to the game's poor 79 out of 100 showing, at least historically, as a low for the series, from 78 different critics on Metacritic. Eurogamer would score the game a 7 out of 10 and state that the game felt like it was kept together by sellotape and was in constant danger to fall apart, which was insanely accurate and something Sumo Digital would attempt to combat with their multiple post-launch updates and never fully succeed at. But there are more than just that as an issue. You also had the browsing tabs for looking for custom levels and how buggy and laggy they were for some reason, and how lackluster the single player was, which was largely designed by a few dozen community members who were brought on to help with development on the project, which just lacked the same direction ultimately and charm and, well, creativity that the previous Media Molecule games and campaigns had. The next major point I referenced previously is the newfound complexity with LittleBigPlanet 3, which created an interesting dilemma and issue, and shows a bit of a misunderstanding of what made the original games so successful, which seemed to be a bit typical for a new developer handling the series. We're talking about factors of 5x, going from 3 layers to now 16 different layers, greatly expanding the game's scope and complexity in the process, which might have been advocated by like hardcore fans who were working on the project, for example, but was not something that was going to translate to high sales or success. And that's because it's a misunderstanding of what makes LittleBigPlanet successful. And that's not complexity of scale and scope in a level designer, because at that point you're competing with actual level designers. That amount of complexity requires a very in-depth single player and tutorial system to properly teach people, and that wasn't what was offered with the third game. Which means you have all this content that not only can people not understand, they likely won't go to the effort to understand it, since then they would have to learn something. LOL. But seriously, LittleBigPlanet and most game maker games are about gamifying the process of making a game, so you don't get too discouraged or bored. If it veers too far into the game design direction, it loses the fun and approachable aspects that make the game sell in the first place. Despite its launch issues though, and a lower score, LittleBigPlanet 3 would still manage to sell the best yet in the series, at 5.5 million copies sold, which was competitive with the first Destiny game and many other top games of the time. But the bigger issue was, this was their massive chance to make an even bigger impact with the LBP IP, and they had the biggest stage to do just that instead. Became the biggest stage in which they would fumble the series' goodwill and name, severely hurting the brand in the process. The amount of people who would quit LBP3 and quit it quickly are enough to sell a successful game in its own right. Now, LBP3 would have a slew of post-launch updates as I stated before, but I won't really dive too far into detail about each of them, because most of them are focused on trying to fix the game's poor performance, corruption issues, and loading time issues. The major updates that I will go more into detail about are Update 1.22 through 1.25, which took place between August 2016 and March 2017. The first of the patches, dubbed the Community Patch, was a complete overhaul of the game's UI, especially in the pod and planet menus, a new restructuring of the game's mode into Play, Create, Community, All About Me, and Store sections too. The second major update added a better filtering system to find the levels that you wanted to. Media Molecule's near decade-long project would finally hit February 2020, titled Dreams, and was set to be another creative-focused video game. Dreams was everything. Seriously, a game development engine, a music editor, an animation maker, and so much more. For $20, you could gain access to this PlayStation 4 title that allowed you to play thousands of different custom games that people would make, due to the game's creation tools that greatly would eclipse LittleBigPlanet's capabilities. Think of like PlayStation's answer to Gmod or Xbox, which was not something that you would expect to hear out loud. Dreams would score impressively too at an 89 out of 100 from 85 different critics, but was limited by a dying platform, as the PS5 would drop the same year, and not having a very marketable package to generalistic fans would also make Dreams, despite all the success it provided, not very successful, at least commercially. PlayStation's allergicness to PC content and crossplay had seemingly killed one of the most talented game development studios ever, and their newest, shiny project that was more toolset than game, sure, but it was fantastic, and nobody knows about it. This meant despite all the innovation and effort poured in, Media Molecule's future was in trouble. A $20 game had to really sell well to do well for their future, when they had been working on the game for close to 10 years at that point. That was going to have to be a lot of copies sold. and those copies just didn't come. The first major domino to fall at Media Molecule would be their technical director, the very talented Alex Evans, stepping down September 4th, 2020. I will briefly follow from this point on because they're still connected to the future of LBP in some sort of way, even if distantly. The next major adventure in the LittleBigPlanet universe would be another Sumo Digital product, this time focusing on Sackboy. Dubbed Sackboy: A Big Adventure, featuring 3D platformer gameplay showcasing Sackboy overcoming various challenges and threats over the course of multiple world maps, similar to previous LBP games. But unlike previous LBP games, hence the name being different, this game would not feature any of the iconic creativity the series was known for, which is why despite being rated quite decently, in fact being better than the third game by a point score on Metacritic, it would fail to sell more than 1.2 million copies. For reference, the indie platformer A Hat in Time managed to sell very similarly, despite not costing nearly as much and having a big IP, most likely. Sackboy ABA isn't a bad game, it's far better than their karting escapade. But for me, it's just another 3D platformer game, offering nothing unique enough besides Sackboy themselves and some of the movement options to differentiate themselves. Finding it being rated at around 82% on Steam, though from very few players who enjoyed the game. While this might seem like a spin-off that you can discard, this game I think pretty much sealed the fate with a future LBP title, spin-off or not. At this point, Sony knew they weren't able to print money with the series anymore, which meant they were going to have to work at things, and corporations hate work. Besides another spin-off mobile title in Ultimate Sackboy later in 2023, the LBP series has yet to see another game in the series since, making it 6 years as of this video since a major spin-off video game was made and 12 years since the previous LBP mainline title had been released, making the series long dormant at this point. Despite this, the communities from the different games, minus the handheld games, which saw their demise back in 2016 largely, all the way back to the first game on the PS3, have managed to stick around, and we're still cranking out level after level. This would all change in 2021 when, after a series of DDoS attacks and their inability to protect against such, Sony would pull down the 3 servers from LBP 1 to 3 and promise to bring them back at a later date, something that would only be about 33% accurate, as they would only bring back LBP 3 and shut down the other servers permanently. These servers and games had taken maintenance to maintain, especially after the recent DDoS attacks, but fans felt betrayed when they weren't getting a straight answer from Sony as to why the servers were shut down. The following year wouldn't be kind to Media Molecule either, in a strangely Greek epic kind of way. As their main original 2 titles were fading away, so were they as a developer, losing another co-founder and this time art director in Karim Atuni. Joining him in his departure was creative director and co-founder Mark Healy, which this news came shortly after the studio announced that they were ending support for their innovative but maligned commercial game, Dreams. Dreams had failed to pay the bills and for their future dreams, and their insistence on it over LBP and other titles had brought the company effectively to its knees, with no other major successful video game projects created to keep them afloat. It was tragic in a sense, especially because they were so talented, and it's not like Dreams wasn't, cool. It just wasn't good enough as a game to sell. was a 2-basket company, and they jumped from one successful basket to another potentially successful one, which just couldn't do enough heavy lifting to keep them afloat. Media Molecule would face some heavy layoffs in October 2023, which would hit them even harder in the sense that they were already a reduced workforce compared to most studios, making them lose 27 of their 135 employees. They were also reportedly entering a consultation process where they were formally talking and listening to all workers in an attempt to make a major change or choice on their next focus, and thus future, as a company. According to the former creative director Mark Healy, he believed that Sony still had faith in Media Molecule as a company, and that the company was still working on a major new IP. Though it was hard to have faith in the company when after just 2 years later they would lose their final company co-founder and David Smith, the last remaining company tech leader. Mark would claim that to his knowledge, was very much focused on a new game still, a game more than a creation tool, likely a comment on their previous focus on Dreams as a title, which was essentially more of a creation tool than a game. The story of Media Molecule, despite so much goodwill and effort that they put into making creativity a serious feature and aspect in gaming, has all but come to an end. While I had faith in them as a company, they are no longer the same company and currently lacking all of their original talent and founders. Their future is likely written in the stars, and I will let you do the thinking as to what that means. Sadly, things wouldn't improve for the aging LittleBigPlanet servers, especially the only remaining servers left for the third game, which would also start facing a number of DDoS attacks that would bring the servers down. Sony would claim that due to technical issues they would be forced to bring the servers down completely, permanently, April 2024, which would ignite the internet in protest, as then not just thousands of levels would be lost to the void, but hundreds of thousands of levels. And that's not counting the levels that were already lost with the first and second game, which already had its servers brought down just a couple years prior. It was sad to see the fate of such a positivity and creativity driving game that would face such an unceremonious death. But although Media Molecule is working on another game, it's not an LBP game, most likely. Because although they are still a Sony studio, they don't own that IP. And it's not very likely that Sony is going to let anybody use the IP anymore, instead choosing to just leave it dormant and feverishly protect its trademark, you know, the American corpo shit dream. Sony was too focused on bombing another live service game and being anti-PC for some reason, which hasn't really yielded them anything positive. And Sumo Digital wasn't going to be a savior there either, when as of 2025 they claimed that they would no longer be working on original IPs, instead choosing to focus entirely on partner-focused development, which they were more so known for previously. That meant that unless Sony decided to do a revival with a completely new developer, the LittleBigPlanet IP was dead. And that's why we featured it on the Death of a Game series. But the timeline has come to an end, detectives, and we have reached the end of this case. With no new LBP games planned and a major title release not having happened for over 10 years, it's safe to say that this is a dormant, if not dead, series. And so, why did LittleBigPlanet, a series at one point known for being a must-buy on its platform of choice, the PlayStation, end up being left in a recycle bin, or a shredder, depending on how you look at things I guess, as it's no longer playable on PlayStation? The business model ultimately presented was conflicting. Sony's mishandling and over-milking, heavy expectations. The original creator had moved on. A poor next-gen, or technically previous-gen, major showing. As much as this story has been trending to a bad ending, I don't like when my Death of a Game series or episodes end on a bad note. It's already a lot of negativity just in the name that seems to trigger people, let's be honest. And, well, I was lucky enough to find out something really positive that would help lift the whole spirits of everything, hopefully. And that's after the shutdown of LBP, they were able to find some success on the PlayStation emulator, including allowing for them to connect on a custom community server LBP Union's Project Lighthouse and download levels that way. So there's a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel here, even if it's just in the way of preservation, which is an important part of the series after all. Shout out to the Stop Killing Games movement. But as of the future of creation-based games or game maker games, it's a similar thing that I said in the Mario Maker video that nobody watched. These sorts of games will always be come-and-go types of games, because they will find it hard to continue to iterate at a pace that makes sense for those who like to play that sort of game. And well, please the overlords who want to keep selling the same kind of game over and over again. It's a tough balance. It's the mix between part game and part creation tool, but I will always be in support of this genre, even if it has already topped out with two very successful games that I already mentioned. Because these sorts of games are what ultimately led to me being involved in video games in the first place, through the form of a more game maker type of game, RPG Maker. Without these sorts of games and game development tool sets, game development and gaming in general will not only be less approachable, it will be less creative. And creativity is kind of the point of all of this, right? We want to keep improving, keep innovating, and keep updating and expanding what gaming is capable of. And in order to do that, we need to teach gamers how to make games, giving them more appreciation for gaming in the process too. Thanks for watching this video. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of LittleBigPlanet as a series, and what was your favorite game and why. Until the next case, I return to my beloved Star Wars.
These are dangerous times. At least, that's what I hear. The Empire? They're everywhere.